Today we begin the story of Napoleon's life. Not at the grand climax. Not at Austerlitz, not in the halls of Versailles, and certainly not astride a white horse in some oil painting fantasy. No, your story starts here, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on a rock with no escape. You, once the ruler of Europe, now sleep under mosquito nets and leaking ceilings. Saint Helena. A name that sounds vaguely like a Catholic school, but in reality? It's the geopolitical version of a time-out corner. You're 46, but your bones creak like a man twice your age. You cough too much. The wine is awful. And worst of all, there is no war left to fight. Instead, there are books. Let's rewind a bit. After your final defeat at Waterloo, a word you will come to despise in at least 3 different languages, you surrendered to the British. Bold move, considering these are the same folks who invented sarcasm and empire simultaneously. You're promised leniency, but instead they ship you 2,000 miles from Paris to a volcanic rock just 10 miles wide. St. Helena isn't even near anywhere worth being near. No cities, no friends, no escape. Just jagged cliffs, stormy winds, and the occasional British officer asking smug questions. Your new house, Longwood, is less palace, more haunted Airbnb. Mold in the corners, rotting floorboards, and some wildly judgmental goats staring at you from the window. It's cold at night, humid by day, and always crawling with someone spying, scribbling, or sneezing. The governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, seems to think you'll swim away if left unsupervised. He watches your mail. He limits your walks. He even counts your teaspoons. This guy? He's less a warden and more a passive-aggressive roommate you never invited. So what do? You do what you've always done when the walls close in, you read. Books flood in from Europe. You request them by the hundreds, volumes on history, politics, philosophy, gardening, astronomy, and even sentimental poetry that would make your old artillery buddies gag. You create a library in exile. Paper becomes your battlefield. Margins become your messengers. And between the pages, you start to wage a quiet little war, not on Britain, not on your captors, but on irrelevance. It's ironic. You, the man who once redrew the map of Europe with cannon smoke and cavalry charges, now redraft your life with footnotes. You treat reading like a military campaign, disciplined, strategic, and a little paranoid. Each book you finish is another skirmish one. Another foothold in the only kingdom left to conquer, your own mind. In the mornings, you lounge in a worn chair in your silk dressing gown, wrapped like a forgotten Christmas present. A steaming cup of weak coffee beside you. Rain pattering against the fogged window panes. You flip open a book, maybe Caesar today, maybe Montaigne, and dive in with that surgical intensity that once sliced through Austrian lines. But this isn't just reading. You're decoding, annotating, comparing, judging. You mutter comments aloud, some dismissive, some inspired, some deeply insulting in French. You argue with dead philosophers like they owe you money. You raise one sardonic eyebrow at the inconsistencies in a historical account. And sometimes, if the book is especially absurd, you chuckle. Just once. Like a general hearing a bad report from a battlefield he already won. Of course, your guards think you're losing it. Talking to himself again, they whisper. Probably plotting an escape in Latin. Let them think that. Let them think anything but the truth, that you're not unraveling. You're remembering. Restructuring. Rebuilding a legacy, one dogged page at a time. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit, exile isn't death. It's rehearsal. And oh, do you love a good rehearsal. Books become your loyal staff. Your council of war. Caesar is your chief strategist. Plutarch your emotional advisor. Machiavelli? He's your HR manager, if HR stood for highly ruthless. Even Ossian, that fog-drenched fraud of a poet, is a kind of dreamlike friend. You surround yourself with these voices because they're all you have. And more importantly, they still listen. You start quoting Latin again. Not because it impresses anyone on this godforsaken island, except possibly the goats, but because it makes you feel ancient and permanent, like a ruin with Wi-Fi. And speaking of ruins, your health? Yeah, not great. You've got chronic stomach pain. Some days, just standing up makes you feel like you've been kicked by a Cossack. Your skin is turning pale. Your hair, once the symbol of imperial flair, is thinning in depressing tufts. One of your servants tries mixing up a kind of island sunscreen from crushed flowers and crocodile poop. You decline? Politely. But honestly, respect for the creativity. You start writing again too, letters, memoirs, small essays. But even in your scribbles, the voice of the books creeps in. You mimic Caesar's brevity, Plutarch's comparisons, Machiavelli's cold logic. You don't just read history now. You begin quietly auditioning for it. Because Exile is not just about survival. It's about spin. And you? You're the world's best spin doctor with a library card. In this dusty, quiet corner of the world, you finally find what you never had in Paris, Milan, or Berlin: uninterrupted time to think, to brood, to doubt, to reframe your greatest sins as strategic missteps, and your victories as inevitable turns of genius. To wonder what your story will look like when someone reads you. Which brings us back to today. You're seated by the window again. Book open. Quill in hand. A storm hisses beyond the cliffs. The British flag flaps outside. A page turns. You squint at the lines. Adjust your coat. Smile. This chapter of your life? It won't end with silence. It ends with a reading list. You build your library like a general prepares a siege, deliberately, methodically, and with a touch of vengeance. The British bring you books with the enthusiasm of someone handing over cutlery to a man on hunger strike. It's part of the humanitarian package. You're allowed furniture, a few French retainers, walks under supervision, and the freedom to turn your cell into a salon of the dead. There's a list. There are requests. There are rejections, no political treatises that might inspire you to rise from the grave. But eventually, the titles begin to arrive. Boxes from London. Parcels from Paris. Crates from sympathetic bookstores. A slow flood of paper and ink into Longwood House. It's a strange sight. The former emperor of the French, elbow deep in straw packaging, pulling out a copy of La Nouvelle Heloise like a kid at Christmas. There's Gibbon, there's Voltaire, there's Buffon, and yes, even a few romance novels. You stash them in every room. You repurpose wine crates as shelves. Books pile up in corners like troops awaiting orders. Longwood transforms from a political prison to something out of a nerdy fever dream. The damp, peeling walls are still there, and the mold hasn't quit, but now there's a humming energy. Ink and imagination start to replace the silence. In one corner of the drawing room, Thucydide sits beside a French gardening manual. In your bedroom, the Iliad shares space with the military survey of Egypt. Every genre. Every era. Fiction, science, religion, poetry. If it's printed and in French, or Greek, or Latin, you're flexible, it's fair game. And you don't just read. You devour. One day, you might spend 6 hours with a scientific treatise on coral formation. The volcano you live on has you in a geological mood. The next, you're tracing Napoleon's favorite love letters in Clarissa. Then it's back to ancient history. Then meteorology. Then economic theory. You chase ideas like they owe you money. Or maybe like you owe them an explanation. And here's the confusing part, you're not consistent. One moment, you're deeply immersed in the art of war, analyzing flanking maneuvers with a gleam in your eye. The next, you're weeping silently over Ossian, convinced you're both fading into myth. It's like watching a chess master cry during a soap opera. But this inconsistency? It's human. And you're finally getting a chance to be that, just a human. Not a general, not an emperor, not a godlike symbol of destiny. Just a guy in fuzzy slippers with a weird obsession for Enlightenment-era prose. Let's pause for a weird detail. You also start reading cookbooks. Yes, you, Napoleon, who once conquered half of Europe with a baguette in one hand and a cannon in the other, are now contemplating stews. There's even a moment when you passionately debate the chemistry of pastry dough with one of your retainers. You argue that a proper French galette is a symbol of order and civilization. And honestly, you're not wrong. But it's not just about entertainment. These books are weapons. Every page is part of your long game, controlling your own legacy. The men watching you don't get it. They think you're retreating into study. That phrase appears in a British report, as if you're folding in on yourself. But you're not retreating. You're recalibrating. Every argument in Plato helps you reframe your own. Every philosophical tangent in Rousseau reminds you that charisma always wins the long war. Every tale of Roman conquest is a mirror you hold up to your former self, examining, editing, correcting. Books let you wander without leaving the island. They give you power in a place where you have none. You even start assigning readings to your companions. Lost Cases, Montholin, Gourgaud, they become your informal book club, whether they like it or not. You pace around the table, grilling them like students who didn't do the homework. And what did you think of the argument in Chapter 3? You ask, eyebrow raised. Someone mumbles something about moral virtue. You sigh dramatically. The lesson continues. In these quiet hours, you invent rituals. You wear your favorite green uniform coat, even when no one's watching. You sip weak wine and pretend it's the claret of old campaigns. You write little notes in the margins. Fool, genius, exactly, nonsense. Sometimes you underline entire paragraphs, then argue with them out loud for an hour. If St. Helena had Yelp, the books you read would all have aggressive 2-star reviews. There's a growing rhythm to your days. Wake up, drink, read, argue, walk under guard, read more, argue some more, write, complain about dinner, reread Caesar. Repeat. It's almost meditative. It keeps you from unraveling completely. Your captors don't understand the danger. They think you're fading. They miss the fact that books are how you prepare to haunt the future. Because that's the thing about exile, it's boring for everyone but the exiled. They think they've silenced you. But in truth, you've just become harder to hear, and that's far more dangerous. Even the volcano under St. Helena seems to agree. It hasn't erupted in millions of years, but sometimes the ground shudders in strange ways. A subtle rumble. A deep breath beneath the surface. Just like you. Dormant, not dead. And while they watch your hands for signs of letters or escape plans, they forget to watch your eyes, reading, scanning, absorbing. And every day, you wonder a little more, what if these books aren't just company? What if they're instructions? You keep coming back to Caesar. It's like an itch you can't stop scratching. His commentaries on the Gallic War stacked permanently at your bedside, dog-eared, annotated, stained with tea and frustration. The Latin flows like music in your head, and every time you reread his words, you can almost hear him, cool, controlled, deadly. Caesar doesn't rant. He reports. He conquers Gaul the way you might write a shopping list, efficiently, tactically, with just enough flair to make the Senate nervous. You envy him. Not because he was perfect, but because he wrote his own story. Literally. First person, third person, it doesn't matter. What matters is that his version stuck. Rome remembers what Caesar told it to remember. The Gauls? A footnote. The Senate? A speed bump. And you? You see the playbook. So you sit on the edge of your creaky St. Helena bed, wrapped in a threadbare wool blanket, nose inches from the page, trying to divine where your own path diverged from his. You trace the sentences with your fingertip, mouthing Latin like a conjuring spell. Veni, vidi, vici. You practically hear the trumpets. Caesar crossed the Rubicon. You crossed the Alps. He conquered Gaul. You won Italy. He seized power. You became emperor. He got stabbed 23 times by his colleagues. Okay, not ideal, but still iconic. And unlike you, he died in the city he shaped. You're stuck in a rock garden with suspicious-looking jam and a terrible pillow-to-mattress ratio. But the fascination runs deeper than hero worship. You start dissecting Caesar's tactics like a surgeon with a borrowed knife. You replay your own battles, Austerlitz, Jena, Marengo, and compare his footwork to yours. Was he more adaptable? More patient? Or just luckier? There's one line you underlined 3 times in red ink. If you must break the law, do it to seize power. In all other cases, observe it. You stare at it for an hour, chewing the inside of your cheek. Sounds familiar? You don't just analyze his wars. You study the framing. How he spins cowardice into caution, treachery into strategy. How he distances himself from failure while pulling glory close like a favorite overcoat. You see it now, not just a general, but a narrator. A master of optics. You chuckle to yourself, almost proudly. This guy was doing PR before PR existed. And now so are you. One afternoon, you corner your valet with a copy of Caesar in hand and demand an impromptu reading session. Tell me, you ask, what do you notice about his tone here? Your valet, who signed up to iron your shirts, not deconstruct ancient rhetoric, stammers through a paragraph and guesses. He seems confident. You close the book gently and stare off into the horizon. Exactly. Confidence as conquest. Voice as victory. That night you sit by candlelight and start drafting notes for your own memoirs, scratching away with uneven ink and a fading quill. You try third person, like Caesar. Napoleon did this, Napoleon considered that. It feels awkward at first, but soon it becomes armor. Third person means distance. It means the man on the page isn't you, not really. He's a character you can mold, polish, elevate. Just like Caesar did. It's almost fun, this reinvention. One moment, you're recounting the Egyptian campaign, complete with blazing sun, ancient ruins, and a totally not failed attempt to align yourself with the mystique of the East. The next, you're digging into military theory, positioning yourself as a philosopher of war rather than just another conqueror with a fancy hat. You see where Caesar edited history in his favor, and you can't help but do the same. That humiliating retreat from Russia? A strategic repositioning. The bloodshed in Spain? A regrettable but necessary step toward continental order. Waterloo? Don't even start. You still swear it was bad luck, Belgian mud, and one overly enthusiastic Prussian. And here's the quirky part, you start talking to Caesar out loud. Late at night. Whispered debates between 2 emperors with bruised egos. You asked him questions he can't answer. Did you ever doubt yourself? Did you regret crossing that river? Did you see the knives coming? The room stays silent, but in your mind, he nods. As if to say, we did what we had to do. And maybe that's why you keep him so close. Caesar's story reassures you that legacy isn't shaped by facts, it's shaped by narrative. If people believe you were a genius, then you were. If they say you were destined for greatness, then maybe you were. Still, there's one part of his story that sticks like a fishbone in your throat. Brutus. Betrayal. You reread the assassination over and over, picturing yourself at that long table in Fontainebleau. You remember the men who kissed your hand one day, then abandoned you the next. Talleyrand? Fouché. Even Murat, your peacock of a brother-in-law. None of them drove a knife into your ribs, but their silence was sharp enough. Caesar died dramatically, with togas flying and statues drenched in blood. You got signed off to a windswept island like a badly reviewed opera singer. Less theatrical. Just as final. You sigh and shut the book. The candle flickers. Somewhere outside, a goat makes a sound like it's choking on existential dread. You smile. Better luck next time, Gaius. But you know this isn't really about him. It's about you. Caesar was the model, the myth, the mirror. You followed his path until it turned to fog. Now you read him not for strategy, but for comfort. Because if his voice could outlive betrayal, exile, and even death, maybe yours can too. Let's not pretend. You read them. Tucked between volumes of military theory and Enlightenment philosophy, there they are, La Nouvelle Heloise, Clarissa, Paul E.T. Virginie, the romance novels. They arrive in battered boxes, their covers flimsy, their spines barely holding together. You pretend to scoff, muttering something about sentimental fluff. But by page 3, you're deep in someone else's heartbreak, jaw clenched, blinking faster than usual. Yes, Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who turned Europe into a jigsaw puzzle of French departments, is now curled up in an uncomfortable chair, emotionally invested in the romantic misfortunes of imaginary teenagers. It's not ironic. It's survival. Because these novels don't just distract you. They reflect something you rarely admitted even at your height. You wanted to be loved, and you never really figured out how. Let's take La Nouvelle Heloise, Rousseau's emotional roller coaster of forbidden love and noble suffering. You read it 3 times. On the second pass, you start underlining passages where Julie resists temptation, not because she doesn't love Saint-Père, but because her moral duty is stronger than desire. You mutter to yourself, "Foolish woman," but you admire her. And maybe, quietly, you envy her clarity. You never had that. Your love life was a military campaign, short bursts of intensity, sudden retreats, strange alliances. You loved Josephine, yes. Even now you remember the scent of her skin, the tilt of her smile, the way she once laughed at a banquet joke you hadn't meant to be funny. But she cheated. You forgave her. Then you cheated, repeatedly. You married Marie-Louise like a man signing a treaty with Austria, and she gave you a son, the King of Rome, a living promise of continuity. But affection? Warmth? It came and went. Mostly went. Now on St. Helena, your lovers are fictional, and they never talk back. They don't ask you to be less intense, or more faithful, or more present. They live inside the page, suspended in longing, and you get to pretend that this aching fidelity, is something you could have had, if only. Here's the quirky bit. You start annotating these books like military manuals. In Clarissa, when Lovelace manipulates the heroine into a nightmare spiral of deception, you scribble. Classic maneuver, emotional siege followed by moral ambush. In Paul E.T. Virginie, you weep when the lovers die in a shipwreck just before confessing their feelings. Per planning, you mutter, wiping your eyes. Logistical error. Your staff doesn't know what to make of it. Montholin catches you one day, reading a particularly juicy scene from a French melodrama. He raises an eyebrow. You lower the book and say, "Don't worry, I'm studying cultural sentiment." Then you wave him off like a professor giving homework. But here's what these novels really give you: permission. Permission to feel something that isn't rage or strategy. Permission to imagine a version of your life where tenderness isn't weakness. Where a man can command armies and read love letters without shame. You even start writing letters again, not to anyone who'll receive them. Just drafts. Love letters to Josephine, to Marie-Louise, to your son, to younger you. They pile up in a drawer, unsent and unsendable. And late at night, you read them back to yourself. Softly. Like lullabies. One passage from Julie lingers in your head. "I feel more than I can say, and I say more than I can do." You nod to the air. That's it. That's the whole mess, wrapped in 12 French words. Your guards think you're becoming sentimental. They mock you quietly in their reports. The emperor appears fond of women's novels. But let them laugh. They don't know that stories about impossible love are what keep your spine from turning to dust. Because you're not just lonely. You're remembering. Remembering how it felt to ride into Paris to thunderous cheers, only to wish one voice, hers, was louder. Remembering the silence after she didn't write back. Remembering how, on campaign, you'd steal moments between maps to whisper her name into the crook of your arm. Remembering that, for all your victories, you never really won at this. There's a day, midsummer, when you read for 9 hours straight. You get sunburnt through the window. You don't notice. Julie dies of heartbreak in the final chapter, and you slam the book shut like a gun misfiring. Cowards, you whisper. All of them. Too afraid to love properly. And maybe you mean the characters. Maybe you mean yourself. Eventually, you start rewriting endings. Literally. You grab your pen and scratch out the final pages. In Paul et Virginie, they survive the storm. In Clarissa, Lovelace dies in a duel before hurting her. In Julie, you give them a cottage and a quiet life, far from society. In each version, someone chooses love over ambition, over status, over duty. You smile. Revisionist literature, you declare. It's a hobby now. These books aren't just for comfort. They're rehearsal. You're practicing what it would have been like to live a different story. One where you were not the emperor, but just a man. A man with a dog, maybe. A garden. A wife who waited at the door instead of behind a barricade of diplomacy. A boy who called you Papa without needing to be coached. A quiet life. You almost had it. That villa in Corsica you dreamed about in 1795. The retirement plan no one took seriously. The olives. The sea. The peace. Instead, you have this, an island shaped like a frown, a room full of books, and a shelf of stories where someone always chooses feeling over conquest. But it's enough. For now. Because every time you turn a page, you remember something you forgot to value. Every heartbreak in fiction makes your own ache a little less uniquely cruel. And every happy ending you invent reminds you that even emperors crave softness. You close the book. Outside, a breeze rustles the hedges. Somewhere, a goat snorts like it knows too much. You whisper to yourself, "She would have liked this one." And for once, you don't mean Julie. It starts with a question you never asked before Exile. What even is a self? You've won empires, lost them, crowned yourself in gold, rewritten laws, and built bridges across both rivers and ideologies. But now, on this wind-battered island with creaking floorboards and too many goats, you're stuck with the one thing you never tried to conquer, your own mind. And Montaigne is waiting. The essays arrive in a box that smells like damp linen and stale rum, and for a moment you sneer. This isn't Caesar. This isn't strategy. This isn't power. It's just some guy talking about his cat, his bowel movements, and whether he likes peas. But you open it anyway. And suddenly you're hooked. Because Montaigne does something you never allowed yourself to do. He wonders out loud. He doubts. He contradicts himself. One paragraph he's praising stoic detachment, the next he's talking about crying like a child. He doesn't polish his thoughts like coins, he tosses them like dice. There's no empire in his pages, no armies, no thunder. Just reflection. And somehow, it hits harder than a cannonball. You start reading one essay a night. Of friendship. Of sorrow. Of idleness. And each one turns your skin inside out. You laugh when Montaigne admits he doesn't really know what he's talking about. You nod when he describes the way pain shrinks the world. You underline his offhand confession about not recognizing himself in the mirror some mornings. You stare at the ink, unblinking. Same. You're Napoleon Bonaparte, and you're finally asking, who is Napoleon Bonaparte? It's disorienting. You built your persona like a fortress, layer by layer, stone by stone. Brilliant strategist. Harsh disciplinarian. Unshakable confidence. But Montaigne looks at his own thoughts like moldy bread, turning them over, sniffing them, wondering if they're still edible. And you think, maybe I should do that too. So you try. You start keeping notes, not commands, not manifestos, but little observations. Felt bored today. Laughed when the goats slipped on the stairs. Don't remember what Josephine's voice sounded like. You call it your anti-memoir, the unheroic, unpolished fragments of a man who's mostly alone with his regrets. You begin noticing things you never had time for before. The way light shifts through the shutters at different hours. The weird stiffness in your right knee when it rains. The joy of peeling an orange very, very slowly. You are becoming dangerously close to chill. Your staff is concerned. General Bertrand asks if you're feeling unwell. You say, I'm discovering the comfort of ambiguity. He blinks like you've just asked him to recite German poetry in a tutu. You reread Montaigne's essay. That to philosophize is to learn to die. You spend all morning turning that one over like a pebble in your palm. Not morbidly, philosophically. What does it mean to die well? To die known to yourself? And not just as a historical caricature in a bicorn hat. Here's the quirky part. You start rating your own moods like battlefield conditions. Clear skies equals confidence. Cloudy equals introspective. Foggy with goat smells equals full existential meltdown. You once kept track of troop morale across Europe. Now you chart your own morale on the back of a wine label. One stormy night, you sit in your uncomfortable chair, wrapped in a scratchy blanket, staring at Montaigne's casual line. Every man carries the entire form of the human condition. You read it 5 times. It hits you, he means you too. You're not just a ruler, or an exile, or a cautionary tale. You're a sample of the species. Like everyone else. Laughable. Mortal. Incomplete. And weirdly, that levels the playing field. You've spent decades building a life no one could relate to, and now one dead Frenchman convinces you that, underneath the medals and myth, you're just like everyone else trying to figure out how to live with yourself. Montaigne doesn't ask you to be grand. He asks you to be honest. You remember a time when you were 16, at military school in Brienne, when you sat alone at lunch because the other boys made fun of your accent. You never told anyone, but that day you vowed to make them all remember you. And now, 4 decades later, you're sitting at the loneliest lunch table of all, wondering if memory was ever worth so much effort. You write in your notebook. Power fades. Self remains. Mostly. You start letting yourself be uncertain. You don't always know why you feel what you feel. You don't always win the argument inside your head. You admit, in writing, that some days you miss Josephine, and other days you don't. You confess that part of you still believes France will call you back, and part of you knows it won't. You even question whether your destiny was destiny, or just a good run of dice rolls. You once said, I am the revolution. Now you murmur, maybe I was just a chapter. And then you sigh. Because Montaigne doesn't resolve you, he opens you up. And that's maddening, but also freeing. One morning you tell Las Cases, I used to think truth was a weapon. Now I think it's just a mirror. He writes it down in his journal. It makes you cringe. It's way too poetic. But he looks so proud of the quote, you let it slide. By the end of that month, your copy of Montaigne is worn out, pages folded and stained with tea and accidental crumbs. You've read some essays 5 times. Others still confuse you. One makes you genuinely furious. Of cripples. You throw the book across the room. Then, 10 minutes later, you pick it up and reread the offensive line to see if maybe, just maybe, you missed something. You didn't. But still, you admire the honesty. You start talking to Montaigne at night. Not like you did with Caesar, less competition, more confession. Do you think I was ever free? You whisper. Do you think any of this made sense? The silence answers, as always. But you keep reading. Not for guidance. Not for glory. Just for company. Because in a place where you've lost almost everything else, the voice of a man who was never emperor, never a general, never even particularly ambitious, might be the only one left that sees you clearly. And you think maybe that's enough. You're halfway through a stale biscuit when you crack open Parallel Lives, and suddenly the room feels smaller. You know these names: Caesar, Alexander, Theseus, Lycurgus. They don't need introductions. They are your pantheon, your fellow immortals. Or so you used to think. But now, on a damp island where the most exciting event is a new shipment of potatoes, these great men start to feel less like peers and more like ghosts. And Plutarch, that ancient biographer with a flair for moral judgment, is your interrogator. He doesn't flatter. He doesn't fawn. He lines them up like suspects, each life with a matching pair, like socks pulled from the laundry of history. One Roman, one Greek. Both flawed. Both magnificent. And both held under a moral microscope that makes you squirm in your chair. You read slowly at first, savoring the rhythm of Plutarch's sentences, letting the grandeur roll over your senses like a Roman chariot rumbling down a marble street. But then he says something offhand, about how true greatness lies not in conquest, but in character, and you nearly choke on your tea. Excuse you? You reread the passage. And then you start reading faster. Because now it's personal. You start with Caesar. Of course. Your unofficial spirit animal. He crossed the Rubicon, seduced Cleopatra, reformed the calendar, and got stabbed 23 times by people he thought were friends. You know his story better than your own. But Plutarch doesn't just tell it, he weighs it. Every triumph sits beside a warning. Every success curls into a lesson. Too much ambition, Plutarch murmurs. Too little restraint. You stare at the page like it's accusing you. Next up, Alexander. The boy king. The man who wept because there were no worlds left to conquer. Sounds familiar. Except Plutarch keeps circling back to his self-control. You frown. Didn't Alexander drink himself to death at 32? That's not self-control, that's ancient frat party energy. But Plutarch sees it differently. He sees a man torn between divinity and discipline. And suddenly, you're not judging Alexander. You're sympathizing. Because you've lived that tightrope, too. Here's the awkward part. Plutarch's moral comparisons start getting to you. He doesn't just say, "This man was great." He says, "This man was great because he governed himself." And you, O magnificent emperor, start wondering if maybe conquering half of Europe wasn't the final scorecard. You turn to the life of Themistocles, the man who saved Athens from Persian invasion and then got exiled by the very people he protected. That one hits a little too close to home. You grip the book tighter. Your heart does something weird and fluttery. You mutter, "Ungrateful fools," but it sounds defensive. You start keeping a list in the margins. Caesar, impulsive. Alexander, glory-obsessed. Lycurgus, disciplined to the point of spooky. Cato, stubborn but honest. Alcibiades, hot mess with good hair. You underline moments of collapse. Betrayal. Hubris. misjudged exits. It's like Plutarch knew exactly which parts would poke your bruises. One night you throw the book down and say out loud, "I was better than half of them." Then you pause. Worse than the other half. Then you pause again. Equal, maybe. At best. That confession tastes sour in your mouth. But it also tastes real. You've spent decades sculpting your legend. You made sure the paintings were flattering, the medals shiny, the speeches unforgettable. You even dictated your own memoirs with heroic pauses baked in. But Plutarch? He doesn't care how many statues you built. He's playing a different game, the one where legacy isn't measured in acreage, but in restraint, wisdom, humility. Yikes. And here's the quirky twist. You start rewriting your life in Plutarch's format. Napoleon Bonaparte, paired with Pyrrhus, perhaps, or maybe Marius. Both brilliant tacticians. Both fell too hard, too fast. You laugh. Then stop laughing. Then keep writing. You list your virtues, strategy, charisma, lawmaking, visionary reforms. Then you list the flaws, pride, mood swings, chronic overreach, occasional dictatorial flair. And under both columns you scribble, Plutarch would not approve of that Egyptian crown stunt. You spend an entire morning wondering who your parallel life would be. Not Caesar. Too obvious. Not Alexander. Too young. Maybe Coriolanus, the Roman general who couldn't play politics and ended up begging for his life in front of his mother. Too on the nose? But here's what makes you come back to Plutarch, night after night, like a moth with complicated feelings about fire. He never says greatness is bad. He just says it isn't enough. And you know what that means now. You, who once measured your days in miles marched and cities taken, now sit quietly with a cup of lukewarm tea, reading about men who mattered for what they gave up, not just what they gained. And you feel, strangely, seen. Plutarch doesn't romanticize the end of empires. He pokes at the soft underside. He reminds you that your story, like theirs, will one day be reduced to one question: did it help the world, or just reshape it? You let that question hang in the air like the smell of last night's stew. Maybe both. You don't know anymore. And that's the strangest transformation of all. You're getting comfortable not knowing. You're starting to understand that the most powerful men in history didn't always leave clarity behind. Just echoes. The morning after finishing the life of Cato, you walk outside and whisper to the sea, "Tell them I tried." A goat sneezes. It's probably not symbolic, but still, you take the moment. Because legacy isn't carved in marble. It's whispered in books like this one. And Plutarch is whispering to you still. You think you know what poetry is. Flowery stanzas. Garden metaphors. Old men in togas weeping under moonlight. You've quoted Virgil in speeches, dabbled in Racine at court, even used bits of Homer to spice up your political theater. But nothing prepares you for Ossian. The first time you read it, it's like being hit in the chest with fog. It doesn't start. It emerges. Mist, ruin, sorrow, lines that don't march, but drift. You squint at the first few pages and think, did I accidentally pick up a Norse weather report? But then the rhythm grabs you, and suddenly you're pulled into a different kind of world. Wind howling across ancient cliffs. Warriors brooding beside cold fires. Ghosts talking to trees. It's not history. It's a fever dream. And you love it. Because after everything, after Elba, after Austerlitz, after all those endless, heavy decisions, you crave the purity of it. These characters don't scheme. They mourn. They fight. They die. They sing about the moon and forget how to spell tactics. And somehow, it feels more honest than most things you've read. You lie back on your creaky mattress and let the sound of it roll over you. The king fell like a rock from the shattered cliff. The light of his sword faded in the hills. You close your eyes. Because Ashen doesn't ask you to think. It asks you to feel. Which is dangerous for someone like you. Let's not forget, you used to be allergic to emotion unless it served a purpose. Love? Weaponized. Grief? Buried. Remorse? Strategically ignored. But here, in the pages of what's supposedly an ancient Scottish epic, which, let's be real, is probably just a fancy forgery with good PR, you find a version of yourself you didn't know you were missing. One night you read the tale of Fingal, warrior, leader, melancholy dad, and you stop halfway through to whisper, "I was Fingal." Not like Fingal. Just was. You don't even know what that means exactly. Maybe it's just the fog talking. Or maybe you're finally letting the poetry work on you. Here's the quirky bit. The British officers on the island also love Ashen. They quote it at you like it's scripture. Colonel Campbell calls it sublime. You pretend to be above it, mock the melodrama, roll your eyes at the endless clouds, but secretly, you've dogged entire passages. You even try composing your own verses in the same misty, ghost-ridden style. One stanza ends with, "The shadow of my crown faded like smoke on the loch." You immediately throw it in the fire. But still, you carry the book with you. Into the garden. Onto the veranda. Even to the breakfast table. Bertrand notices. He asks, "Why Ashen?" And you pause mid-chew and say, "Because it reminds me what it's like to die beautifully." He stares. You sip your tea like you didn't just say something absurdly dramatic. But it's true. In Ashen, death isn't defeat. It's legacy. It's sorrow wrapped in moonlight. There's no shame in falling, only in forgetting to mourn properly. It's the only world where tragedy feels cleaner than victory. Which is convenient, because lately, you're more of a tragedy guy. You remember Josephine again, suddenly, sharply. The way she said your name when you were just Bonaparte. Not yet. Emperor. You remember the time you pretended not to miss her, and the time after that, and the time after that. You remember writing her from campaign after campaign, each letter getting more stilted as the myth of you thickened like paint over canvas. You underline a line in Ashen. She passed like a dream by my side. I saw her not again. You don't cry. You're still Napoleon after all. But something shifts. Ashen helps you soften the sharp edges. That's what poetry is, you realize, not escape, but sanding. It takes the jagged, humiliating truth of your exile and turns it into a kind of myth. Not lies, just reframing. You're no longer a prisoner. You're a warrior king watching his past shimmer across the glen, listening for voices on the wind. You start dreaming in his voice. Not literal voice. You don't hear Scottish ghosts whispering in your ear, though honestly, if any book could do that, it's this one. But the mood of it seeps in. Everything becomes a little slower, more solemn. You speak more softly. You let silence sit in the room like a guest. You even start using metaphors in casual conversation. When Lost Cases asks how you're feeling, you say, "Like the last leaf on the storm's branch." He nods politely, probably terrified. You don't explain. Here's what no one on the outside understands. You didn't fall because of a military blunder. You fell because people stopped believing in the story. Your story? The unstoppable rise. The destiny fulfilled. The man born to rewrite the world. Ashen reminds you that stories end, and when they do, they deserve to end with a song, not a spreadsheet. So you let the song unfold. Each page you read becomes a kind of farewell. To glory. To youth. To the man you were when you still believed cannon smoke could fix anything. Now you believe in mist, in memory, in warriors who sit by the shore and stare into nothing, waiting for someone to remember them. You write one more poem, short, cryptic, moody. Something about the bones of kings beneath cold tides. You don't show it to anyone, but you slip it inside the pages of Ocean, as if the book itself might carry it somewhere. Maybe to the future. Maybe just to the wind. Because when you're gone, they'll argue over numbers and dates. But this foggy, teardrop-shaped ache of a book might actually understand what it felt like to be you. You never read the Bible for comfort. You read it for power, for rhetoric, for symmetry. You quoted Revelation during coronations, used the Exodus as political metaphor, and once compared yourself to Job in a fit of particularly ambitious self-pity. But now, in the quiet corners of exile, when you pick up that heavy old book, something is different. You don't read it like an emperor anymore. You read it like a man who's running out of pages. It starts innocently enough, just a verse here and there, out of boredom. But then you hit Ecclesiastes, and it knocks the air out of you. Vanity of vanities, it says, and you blink like someone just insulted your entire resume. You go back. Reread it. Slower this time. All is vanity. You sit there, staring at the line, and for the first time in months, you actually feel like a man instead of a myth. It's the tone that gets you. Not anger. Not fear. Just resignation. This calm, devastating idea that everything you built might be wind. Not even dust. Wind. Invisible. Already gone. You start working your way through the Psalms. Not the showy ones either. The ones that ache. That spiral. That cry out into empty spaces without expecting an answer. You read them by candlelight, hunched in your chair, feeling small. And weirdly, that feels like a relief. Because for once, you don't have to pretend to be the man with the answers. You can just read. There's something about those Old Testament figures that makes them feel like comrades now. David, who danced and despaired in equal measure. Moses, who led but never entered the promised land. Even Saul, the chosen and fallen king. You start scribbling little notes in the margins, mapping their failures to your own. And then you get to Christ. That one is harder. Not because you doubt, but because it's humbling in a way you never signed up for. The man who said, "Turn the other cheek," who washed feet, who broke bread with the traitor at the table. You keep asking yourself what he would have done with an empire. Probably given it away. You stare at that thought like it's a blade in your hands. You, who crowned yourself in Notre Dame. You, who renamed time and rewrote laws. You spent your whole life seizing, holding, expanding. The idea that letting go might be the higher form of strength. That's uncomfortable. But you don't dismiss it. In fact, you write a letter to Bertrand one afternoon, asking if he remembers the parable of the prodigal son. You don't say why. He probably thinks it's a metaphor for your return to power. But it isn't. Not anymore. Because you're starting to understand that the Bible doesn't promise restoration. It promises presence. There's this one line in Isaiah. "In quietness and in trust shall be your strength." You write it out and pin it to your wall with a rusty nail. You don't tell anyone. You just leave it there, like a secret. Like a soft surrender. Meanwhile, the British guards still think you're plotting something. They imagine your books are codes. They check your papers for hidden messages. As if you'd use Jeremiah as military cipher. The only hidden message is this: you're not fighting anymore. Not with guns. Not with plans. Just with memory. You read the crucifixion slowly. You wince, not at the pain, but at the misunderstanding. The way the crowd turns. The way truth is mocked in public. You underline a phrase in the Gospel of Luke. And they said, "Let him save himself, if he be Christ, the chosen of God." You know what it's like to hear that kind of sarcasm. To fall while people cheer. To be remembered for the collapse more than the climb. It doesn't make you holy. It just makes you human. That's the strangest twist in this entire, ridiculous, epic story, that in the end, you don't find redemption in conquest, or law, or legacy. You find it in slowing down. In asking questions you never let yourself ask before. What if my enemies were sometimes right? What if my victories caused more harm than I saw? What if the world I wanted to build needed less of me, not more? You don't always like the answers. But you don't run from them now either. There's no audience. No applause. Just one man and one book, sitting on a wooden chair, listening to the sound of waves and wondering if grace is real. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of something. Because in the end, what you read in Exile isn't just books. It's yourself. Flawed. Tired. Brilliant. Regretful. But also, finally still. You reach the final page of the Gospel and close the book gently. The candle flickers. Outside, a goat knocks something over, as usual. You don't move. You just sit there. And whisper, so softly that only the night can hear. I was here. Word count, 1089. Now the story slows. The fire burns low, its glow softening every corner of the small room where you once read, once raged, once remembered. Outside, the wind rolls over the hills of St. Helena in long, tired sighs, brushing through the grass like fingertips closing a book. No more marching. No more speeches. Just the quiet rhythm of breath and page and breath. You let your thoughts wander, not forward but back. Not to the battles or the banners, but to the books. The ones that met you in silence, challenged you in solitude, and offered mirrors when no one else dared. You think of Plutarch's comparisons, Ossian's foggy sadness, the Bible's fierce softness. You think of how each one pulled you, just slightly, closer to something you never fully understood. Not redemption, maybe, but recognition. And slowly, as if the world itself has exhaled, you feel the sharp corners of memory begin to blur. The uniform fades. The titles dim. What remains is not the emperor, not even the exile. Just the reader. Just the man. You lean back, eyes closed, letting the story settle where no soldier ever reached, beneath the armor, beneath the myth. The pages turn no more. But they echo. Softly, like waves. Gently, like breath. And somewhere in that gentle hush, the story ends, not with a bang, not with a crown, but with the last line of a well-worn book. And a whisper.